So I just want to start by saying hello, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be back here at Stanford. I grew up in the Bay Area and have long-time Stanford connections and worked at IDEO for many years right downtown Palo Alto. So it's really a pleasure to be here talking about design. And I think kind of bringing, like Michael was saying, a practice-based perspective back to a conversation about human-centered computing and HCI-type work. So I wanted to start just by framing, I guess, the broad brushstrokes of what an engineering degree or a practice ought to be. Typically, we define engineering as the application of science to addressing human needs. And in the university environment, for sure, typically what that means is that you'll spend about 99% of your resources on engineering science, right? And the assumption is that if you have a very good scientific kind of research, critical thinking kind of tool set, that will be a very useful thing when you go out into the world to engineer things. Here at Stanford, the computer science department is within an engineering school. And you've got human-computer interaction, which is very much focused on human needs. And there's a certain way of thinking about human needs in the context of an engineering program. The question that I've got is, that basically the usefulness of needs to engineering really requires deeply understanding what humans need. And if you're spending 99% of your resources on a scientific kind of research-based perspective, who's really responsible for this stuff? Who should be responsible for this stuff? Typically, the way that most engineering programs will focus that is by saying, well, that must be scientists, right? Scientists who study human needs. And that makes good sense, because scientists are smart, and they have strong perspectives on the world. But if you actually think about it, clearly you've got the sciences, and then you've got, well, the humanities, right? You would think the humanities would be the discipline interested in human needs. Unfortunately, I don't know, most engineers don't want to be told what to do by the humanities, right? Because engineering is a kind of very legitimate technical field. And so what ends up happening is that you get scientists who are, I don't know, you can start to think about like where does the money come from for the research, or how is it being funded, or who's in charge of kind of understanding which things should be engineered. Should it be politicians, right? Maybe it's people at NSF, right, whose job it is to fund research in engineering. And it's their job to kind of figure out which directorate would be most appropriate for advancing human needs in engineering. And that seems reasonable, but of course, what's actually going on here is that the people who are at NSF are former engineers who are leaders in engineering, right? And they're the ones who get to think broadly about what the future of the field should be. These are people that I would like to call designers. So the reality is that pretty much anyone who's doing engineering, or anyone who's doing research for that matter, is a particular kind of designer. They're an engineering designer or a computer science designer. They're designing computer systems. They might not be trained as designers in a kind of classical practice-based sense, though. So one of the things I want to talk about today is just the history of human-centered design and kind of where it's going. And there's a deep history of integration between human needs and engineering. Most recently, we've talked about this as human-centered design. In HCI work, as a scientific research discipline, human factors has generally been what we call the discipline that studies how humans interact with their environment with the aim of improving the safety and quality of human experiences interacting with technology. And if you go to the CHI conference, it is still the ACM conference on human factors and computing systems. Okay, human factors has a deep history going back at least to the Industrial Revolution, at which point, this is Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, which if you haven't seen that, it's a kind of classic silent film on the modernization of industry and sort of the dehumanizing qualities that brought to people who are now going to work in factories, and kind of the disruption that had on the sort of, the craftsmen or the guild or the people who prior to that had, small kind of boutique shops or whatever. During the Industrial Revolution, there really wasn't a lot of attention paid to humanizing technology or thinking about design in that way, until during the Second World War, we had such a rapid advance in the way in which technology was being engineered that airplanes would show up at the front lines which pilots didn't know how to fly, because the technology was advancing and kind of innovating so quickly. This is a photo from a manual of a fighter plane in World War II. And it actually led to huge amounts of fatalities, right? Like pilots literally didn't know how to control these things. They couldn't fly them, they couldn't land them, it was very dangerous. And so there's this new field born around human factors engineering, really starting to understand, hey, there's a human in the loop controlling this plane. We need to make it, at the very least, operable, right? And then, as time progressed after that, we find ourselves with digital technology, right? In the 70s and then into the 80s, we have user interfaces happening. And this is where usability becomes a big concern. It's no longer life-threatening. The plane's not going to crash, but it's really, really frustrating. I don't know how to save my email or whatever it might be. So that's been kind of the history of human-computer interaction has basically been getting psychologists and other kinds of scientists interested in understanding human behavior integrated into engineering research to make things safer or more usable. On the flip side, there's also a history of design. And design has always been a kind of human-centered discipline, right? So these are photos from Raymond Loewy, who was an industrial designer working in the 30s and 40s primarily. And he was doing a lot to sort of humanize technology in a different way, thinking about how does it make you feel, right? Kind of, can we skin it? We'll make it more aesthetically interesting. It has something to do with kind of styling, has something to do with advertising. You see, we're making machines and we're making them feel like they're fast or feel like there's something that I want to own or consume. Then we know Charles and Ray Eames, who kind of took it a step further. They really started integrating human-centered methodologies into the way in which manufacturing processes happened, and started thinking about making objects, but also really much broader visions about the future of the world and how people should cooperate together. They made a lot of instructional, educational films, and really did a wonderful job of kind of pioneering the human-centeredness of design in a more kind of consumer-facing, personal, one-on-one relationship that you might have with a brand. This is Henry Dreyfus, another human factors engineer, sort of designer, who's pretty famous for this work he did on the measure of man, looking at kind of average heights and distances and movement and degrees of freedom of kind of the average American man and woman, and built a whole book specking out all of those things which would help designers and engineers make better working environments for them to live in. And then, of course, more recently, we have human-centered design has really gone very commercial. There's been a whole sort of methodology that's grown out of many places, including the product design program here. It's been commercialized at places like IDEO and lots of consulting firms all across the world. And then even more recently, we have kind of, it's no longer about human-centered making just of products, but actually the whole process or service platform by which one does consulting work has become a product in its own right. Right? So now we're selling design thinking and design processes to people who can kind of read a cookbook on how to practice human-centered design by following the steps and applying it in their own life. Okay, so I'm going to talk very quickly about human-centered design just to kind of frame where the discipline is now. And then I want to spend the rest of the talk today kind of looking at the future of what I'm going to call post-human-centered design. And this has been an area that I've been thinking about since really I got involved in robotics research several years ago when I was doing my PhD work, thinking about, I don't know, if we're going to be thinking about human-centeredness and applying it to technology, particularly at this really kind of critical moment in human evolution where technology has become so fundamental to all of our interactions with pretty much everything, and when we're kind of on the verge of new kinds of technology that will have kind of sentient, autonomous, intelligent life, right? We should start to be thinking about sort of, well, post-human factors, right? Post-human-centered design. What's coming next? What's after human-centered design? And how can we design for the people who don't exist yet, for the post-humans? How can we make experiences for them? So human-centered design, as practiced today, is typically broken into these phases. We've got need finding, form giving, and communication, or implementation of some kind. Design as a discipline, for the most part, is about envisioning a future and kind of pointing the way, maybe specifying how something should get implemented, and then allowing someone else to do the kind of delivery and manufacturing or development of that process. So at a place like IDEO, you've probably seen many diagrams that look something like this, but basically you have a need-finding phase up front, which is about understanding, observing, and synthesizing data from real people. Then you have a form-giving, and here we're rapidly prototyping and iterating and evaluating and refining our design. And then at the end, we sort of, we see what we learned, we iterate a few more times, we wrap that all up, communicate what we found, and somebody will take it and implement it or build it. At IDEO, these are typically broken into phases like this. So, when they were just starting out as a kind of product design engineering shop, they were doing a lot of manufacturing work. And then, their big differentiator was around coming up with new concepts for how to solve problems and building rapid prototypes and showing them to people and getting feedback. Today, probably 98% of the work that they do is in this first phase 0 space, which is really about going much deeper into designing what the problem is, thinking strategically about how to solve it, doing some ethnographic research, going in the field, synthesizing your findings, identifying opportunity areas, generating principles for design, building an opportunity framework, like where is this project going to go, kind of reframing the project to make sure you're aligned. And then you'll generate your concepts, brainstorm, prototype, do some preliminary design work, evaluate, validate, iterate. And then at the end, if the project even gets here, a lot of times this work happens in-house or overseas or shopped out to a vendor. There'll be engineering, cost analysis, development work, and all of that to make the thing real. Stepping away from this, you can think kind of broadly about what's happening here. Is the idea that in the phase 0, this first phase, really what we're doing in the project is we're making something that's useful. Okay? So we're thinking about what is it that people want, how is our design going to really improve and enhance their life in some way that's meaningful, and we're going to design that. And this middle phase is kind of where a lot of this history of probably the human factors work is much more about ergonomics or usability, right? We've got a design, we just need to make sure that it's functional, right? I can accomplish the tasks that I need to do. It's a tool that works for me. I can get the job done. And here in the late phase, I can make things delightful. So this is kind of back to Raymond Loewy's work, right? I can take a locomotive and I can skin it in a way that makes it look fast, right? Or I can make a product and I can package it in a way that makes it feel like something I want to consume. But at this point, the useful work and the usable work has already happened. And the best the designer can hope to do is kind of make it delightful. And that's why traditionally, when designers have been asked to solve problems really late in the phase, the design is really prevented from being more useful or usable than it was to begin with. And that kind of perpetuates the idea that design is about superficial aesthetics and styling, right? So if you have a designer who has all these strategic skills, and you put them in, I don't know, a company like Microsoft, and they have to design all the icons for PowerPoint for the 50th time, because there keeps being a reorg, right? They're not delivering the strategic value that they could. The best they can do is make cute icons that make people smile, but it's not really changing the usability or the usefulness of the tool in the first place. And what we really want from design is usefulness, right? We want to make things that make the world better. And that's why this need-finding phase is really critical. Need-finding applies to all areas of design practice or research. Typically in design practice, that's product design of physical products, branding, strategy work. All of those will benefit from kind of contextualizing research and a good, deep empathy for what people really need. And in consumer industries, this is really important just because it's so expensive to be designing the wrong thing, right? It's very expensive to engineer products. It's a very competitive marketplace. Everybody is trying to capture eyeballs quickly online with their new app. And if you're building the wrong thing, or you miss it by a couple weeks, or there's a release of something else just at the wrong time, it can be pretty much the death of your company. Okay, so basically the point from human-centered design is it's really essential that when we apply this methodology, we're using it to work on the right design problem, and we're getting as early into the field talking to real people, understanding real needs as we can to make the most strategic value. Okay, so now I want to look at the future and what might be coming next. So just a definition. Posthuman, not sure how many of you have heard this term. This has been kind of kicking around in the kind of theory literature for some time. Many of you have probably heard of postmodernism, right? So we had modernism, and then we had kind of, late modernism, and then that kind of became postmodern sometime in the 70s and 80s, and everything got radically kind of decontextualized and very subjective, and people were thinking a lot about kind of power relationships and the structuring of information in the computerized age. It's what happens after modernism. Posthumanism takes a similar kind of critical, theoretical look at what happens after the human, and particularly thinking about what happens when the technologies that we have become so deeply integrated into what it means to be human that all of our sort of humanist values, everything that we consider to be humanism, no longer applies. And the basic capacities of these future humans so radically exceed those of present humans that we can't really consider them to be human by our current standards. So for example, here we have a human, right? This is an ordinary human, and they live quite happily. And then, maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago, a bunch of things started to change, right? We got computers, then the internet. Now we have mobile devices, virtual environments, augmented reality, machine intelligence, genetic engineering, organ transplants, designer drugs, right? Many of these things were very disruptive at first. I'm sure in the 70s, if you got a heart transplant, right, that's like ethically quite dubious. It's not yet fully approved. We don't know if it's safe. Is that totally creepy? Now it's like standard practice, right? We've got, you drive up 101, there's a huge like organ transplant center. And they're shipping people in from all over the world and putting organs on ice, and that's completely normal. This is what the posthumanist philosophers call the transhuman. And we are all now transhumans. We're living in this transitional moment between being human and being something else. And those technologies are changing us. And what's coming next, and it's not hard to imagine if you look at science fiction or you do research in this space, is that computers are getting faster and faster. We're going to have autonomous robots performing more and more manual tasks and intelligence tasks. We're looking at technologies like life extension. Maybe you can live forever. You just keep swapping out the organs forever, or you'll become kind of cyborg, right? You'll get a cyborg, I don't know, cochlear implant. It's basically, it's a bionic ear, right? We're thinking even about once we have superintelligence, right? Maybe you can upload your mind into the cloud and just like live in a virtual reality space. You can design your own children. Think about artificial life, colonize space, simulate yourself, and determine what kind of drug you should take to live longer or be happier. Yeah?
So these theories don't really posit that humanness can slide. That is, what's currently considered human may have been post-human-like in many ways 1,000 years ago. Like, we can solve diseases. Sure. We can access information just at the tip of our fingers. Like, these are very big differences.
Yeah, it's significantly different. And I think yes, even I mean in the world of theory, everything is a theory, right? So it's all hypothesis, but it's fair to say whether we call ourselves we're in modernism or we're in postmodernism. Maybe postmodernism is just a very high form of modernism. As far as humanism goes, something is definitely changing because
Okay, so I buy the all theories are wrong, some are interesting. That line, sure, I get it. This particular transition, then, what is different from this transition compared to, say, what like Vannevar Bush was thinking when he was thinking
I'm almost there. So I think what's happening here is, in theory, the post-human is really no longer human. So it doesn't resemble anything that could have happened without humanity intervening in itself in a way which is really pretty extremely different than the past. And the reason it's different has to do with evolution. Humans are designed by nature, if you will. We evolved over millions of years in response to our environment. And we can say that maybe evolution is speeding up, but evolution is shifting into a space of silicon, into a space of the digital. The transhuman is designed by humans, right? And we've seen that design has become a really major deal, right? We have engineering of pretty much anything. Look around, right? There is nothing that we interact with, apart from nature in a state park somewhere, maybe, that hasn't been designed by humans. And increasingly, even our environment, like everything is designed by humans, right? The post-human is unique in the sense that it's post-evolutionary, right? So if you became an organism which could choose, basically design all of its children before they were born by chance, right? Could simulate itself and determine how best to survive, could multiply itself across lots of bodies, could upload its mind into the cloud and put it into another body, we've really exceeded the limitations of our kind of mechanical limitations. And we've moved into a purely kind of digital platform for life, which is pretty significantly different. And there's tons of theory here, and it's very controversial, and much of it is kind of wackadoo science stuff. And much of it is also quite compelling to be thinking about kind of strategically about what's coming. I don't know, I think a lot of times science fiction and kind of speculative research does a lot to ask important questions about whether that's a future we want to live in or not. And a lot of times there's a big disconnect between the scientific fact and the popular perception, right? Cloning is really dangerous. Genetic engineering is really bad for the crops, right? The scientific story is much more complicated than that, but it gets the discussion happening in public, and people start thinking really seriously about what kind of future do I want my kids to grow up in, right? What's the future of our planet going to be? if you look at this, you see that there's really this huge convergence of technologies happening this century, right? Probably in the next 20 years. We've got biotech, nanotech, infotech, cognitive science, all coming together in a pretty radical way. And what it's effectively doing is making new kinds of life. So if I'm a kind of biological human and I have new nanotechnology or new robot technology, I'm becoming a cyborg, right? Right now, we're already all cyborgs, right? We're effectively soft cyborgs. We live in an Internet of Things, connected to the cloud, with our Google Glass, and our Fitbit, and our phone in our pocket, right? These are essentially extending us into a software space. We've got ubiquitous computing, pervasive computing. We are cyborgs, okay? Then you've got nanotechnology combining with infotechnology, and you've got lots of people coming up with, well, we can effectively make lots of little micro-swarming robots, and they can have sensors on them, and we can drop them from airplanes, or we can fly drones all over the place, right? We're effectively building new kinds of artificial life. There may be fundamental kinds of life. They're about as smart as an insect or a cockroach, or maybe a rodent. But over time, those are going to become increasingly alive, and we can start to consider them as such. In the infotech space, we've effectively got simulated life, right? We can run entire population. We can run SimCity on our computer, right? And we can make a whole simulated city of people who are doing stuff, or a whole simulated ant colony that effectively behaves like an ant, because the program has that many neurons in its code. Then we've got the idea of meta life. So, I don't know. You could, this gets kind of metaphorical, but you could kind of think about it like, right now in your brain, right, there's a whole lot of neurons. And they've got synapses, and they're firing electrical pulses, and each neuron is quite content and quite alive, just as one little cell, doing what it does, talking to the other neurons. We are now all living in a kind of environment here where we're sort of like the neurons, right? We all communicate with each other. We live in our little bubble. We go to work. We upload stuff to the internet. And we've got this kind of meta-consciousness coming online, right? The internet could switch on and start to pay attention. So it's a new kind of meta-life. It's hard for us to see it because it's in a whole different paradigm space. But the point here is that we're entering this really pretty radically different kind of post-human existence where we've got cyborgs, artificial life, simulated life, meta-life, all kind of coming online and interacting in really interesting, unexpected ways.
Can I push?
Sure.
Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I completely agree with my argument here, but just to sort of air it. I feel like this slide could have existed about 20 years ago.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what's changed. Why now?
So it's true. From a research perspective, it's true. I think why now is that it's in the public imagination in a much more real way. These changes are now, we're getting all the stuff on Kickstarter. We're getting updates all the time from our app, from our app store. We've got people dropping out of high school to make, to make crazy things that are doing incredible stuff. We've got artificial intelligence happening. I think it's just becoming much more pervasive, and it's becoming exponential. That's all. We're on an exponential curve. And the point is basically just that the paradigm shift rate for technology change, we've got Moore's law, right? So whatever it is, every 2 or 3 years, the amount of space on our silicon chip doubles, and we've got more and more computational power. And it can be really hard for us to envision that from our current point in time, because all we really have to reflect on is a linear view of the past. And when we look at our clock, it's ticking at the same speed. So typically humans, when we think about our past, right, we've got this intuitively kind of linear view of our exponential history. So just for example, in 1990, some biochemists had transcribed about a 10,000th of the human genome. And given their rate of progress at the time, the experts in the field of genetics predicted that it would take, or it could take, up to 100 years to complete. And that was accomplished in under 15 years. Here's Ray Kurzweil, famous futurist and crackpot scientist, depending if you like him or not. But he's drawing on a lot of pretty robust kind of empirical studies of computational power keeps doubling, right? So we won't experience 100 years of technological advance in the 21st century. We will witness on the order of 20,000 years of progress when measured by today's rate of progress, or about 1,000 times greater than that was achieved in the 20th century. That's pretty phenomenal. Here's growth in supercomputer power on our logarithmic graph. Okay, it's now the year 2015. When I first did this talk, it was 2010, and there's been several new supercomputers since then. Kurzweil argues that what is required for what he calls functional brain simulation is whatever this is, 10 to the 15th floating point operations per second in terms of supercomputer power. Now, this says nothing about the software that your brain is running. So when he says functional simulation of the brain, he basically means there's enough there to model the kinds of ins and outs of, say, the hippocampus, the visual cortex, all the different parts of the brain. Unfortunately, neuroscience is nowhere near deep enough along the way to fully understand how all that stuff is wired. But the point here is just we have raw computational power. And within some amount of time to get the design right, we could be running a functional simulation of the human brain by 2013, which is 2 years ago. For human brain neural simulation, the required computational power would be equivalent in 2025 to basically build a simulation model of every molecule in every neuron in every synapse in the human brain, which is pretty phenomenal. And if you look forward from that, you can basically do the same calculation by dividing the cost in half every year, so that by the year 2045, we would have human equivalent personal computer for $2. Okay? That's 30 years away. It's coming fast. And, frankly, by the year 2030, it would cost probably half what your laptop costs today. Okay, now let's look at the world population. Okay, we've got, by recent estimates, about 7 billion people on the planet. And, people think that's going to trail off at some point, probably, as we get to the end of the century. But we're adding in all of these supercomputer people, right? No matter how you look at it, right? This is what the futurists call the singularity, right? Infinite population by the year 2045. Of course, what really is the difference between having 2 billion and having infinite billion, right? Maybe not a whole lot if our social and kind of political systems haven't changed. But it matters a lot in the sense that we need to understand how that computation will affect the rights of individual humans to vote, or the ability of individual humans to perform the work that they need to do, or to communicate with others, right? The distribution of that technology is going to be a very important issue. If current accelerations in computer power continue to increase at their current rates, we will have a singularity by the year 2045, as humanity will have created seemingly infinite computational power. Many futurists hope that the Earth's ecosystem will be transformed into this computer-controlled techno-Gaian utopia, and it will all kind of balance itself out. We're living in the clouds, everything is taken care of, we have infinite resources, solar power, and everybody's happy. And people will upload their minds into this eternal simulation of pure fantasy and live forever in silicon wafers. But clearly, whatever happens, to get to whatever state that's going to be, we're going to face some pretty profound challenges. Human intelligence will effectively be obsolete. The tools that we have, maybe the software we're running, the social structures we have will be in place, but the intelligence itself will no longer be relevant. Okay? Economic wealth is already, frankly, in a bank, right? But it will be entirely in the hands of super intelligent machines. Okay? They'll make the decisions on where to invest. They'll make the decisions on what to do, presuming we manage to survive at all. And it's likely that the people who do end up at the very tippy top will be the ones who control those supercomputers and have all the wealth already. So the point here is just that there's numerous existential and ethical risks coming. We don't know what they all are, but we have to confront them and we should start thinking about them if we're really interested in human-centered design, right? The future of humans. Let's think about things that can go wrong, okay? There's a guy at Oxford named Nick Bostrom who's done a ton of really good posthumanism work, and he wrote an excellent paper on the existential risks, which this draws from. Basically what he's saying is, if you have a personal risk that's endurable, like your car gets stolen, or you get killed, okay? That is still, it's not endurable to you, it's terminal, but it's kind of local in scope, right? Here's a slightly bigger local scope. There's a recession, and everybody loses their job. Or there's genocide, right? Permanent enslavement. Everybody is pretty much taken out, right? That's not good. Here's the thinning of the ozone layer. It affects everyone, everywhere, right? It's endurable, but it's global. An existential risk is in this top category. It's something that's global, and it's something that's terminal. And the scary thing is that many of these are being created by us right now. An existential risk is defined as one where an adverse outcome would either annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtail its potential, okay? So the issue here, and it's very different than human-centered design or engineering practice to date, is that existential risks don't give you a second chance if you're wrong. You can't do rapid iteration and prototyping with existential risks. It doesn't work, right? For there to be a risk, given the knowledge and understanding available, it suffices that there's some subjective probability of an adverse outcome. Our only possible course of action is to examine possible future scenarios and use our best current subjective estimate on what the objective risk factors may be. Even if later we determine that some of them are objectively impossible, we don't know whether something is objectively risky or not, then it's risky in the subjective sense, and the only thing we can do is base our decisions on that subjective reality, because we can't make a mistake. Okay, consider this plot. Just imagine that the technological potential of humanity is getting stronger, and we'll call it the cultural potential is getting stronger. Okay, and right now we're in this sort of humanist space, moving into the transhuman space, heading towards post-humanity and uploading into the cosmic mind. These are the 4 kinds of existential risk classifications that can happen. Right? We can go out with a crunch, with a bang, with a whimper, or with a shriek. We'll look at them quickly just before we move on. So a bang would be the immediate destruction of Earth-originating intelligent life altogether. It could be a natural disaster, an accident, an intentional act of destruction, like a nuclear holocaust, right? We start World War III, everything gets blown up, no life survives, bang. Okay? The deliberate misuse of nanotechnology. Okay? Somebody in a lab somewhere makes nanotech, targets at some people, it gets out, multiplies, kills everything. Badly programmed superintelligence. It shuts down all of the global stock markets, and it shuts down all of our ability to produce anything, right? It sort of takes control of our systems. That could launch any of the other ones, right? It could set off a nuclear war of its own. We could have a genetically engineered biological agent. The accidental misuse of nanotech, right? This is what they call the gray goo scenario, where it sort of sneaks out, and then stuff goes wrong. Asteroid or comet impacts pretty much did in the dinosaurs. We could hit an asteroid. We could have runaway global warming, and we're too late down the road, right? We can't turn the clock back. Naturally occurring disease, yeah. Ebola might, I don't know, might evolve and become airborne. And, we've got a terrible pathogen. A physics disaster. We just blow up the universe, right? I don't know. What about this one? What if in the future we have superintelligence, and the superintelligent future people decide that they want to predict ways of surviving, so they set up simulations of possible futures or possible pasts, and we're living in one of them. And for whatever reason, they decide to switch us off. Could happen. Or something unforeseen, right? You just never know, right? It's a risky world. Something might happen. We need to be prepared. Okay, let's think about crunches. So these are the ones where technological potential to reach post-humanity is somehow thwarted, but human life sort of continues. So the most common of these are like a near bang, right? There's some kind of resource depletion, ecological destruction, civilization fails to recover in the aftermath of a near bang. There's lots of dystopian movies that kind of live in this space, the kind of Mad Max, Road Warrior stuff. Okay. We've got the shrieks. Shrieks are an interesting case in that they introduce the notion of values, right? So this is one in which an undesirably limited post-humanity is achieved, although without knowing what's desirable, it's really hard to identify whether we're on that path or not. So for example, we could have a flawed superintelligence, which just kind of like, I don't know, convinces us that it's doing a great job, but consumes all the resources. We could be taken over by a transcending upload, right? Some super billionaire Hollywood mogul is the first one to develop superintelligence, uploads his mind, and then, wreaks havoc on everyone else. I don't know if you've seen Gattaca, is the notion of this genetic divide. So there's kind of multiple classes of humans. There's those who have access to biological agents that enable them to replicate and stay healthy and become sort of superhumans, and then there's everyone else who's in a sort of second class. We have the Terminator scenario, the repressive totalitarian global scheme, and so on. And then we have whimpers. Okay? These are where somehow core human values or potential is slowly eroded by evolutionary development. It probably would take a really long time. I don't know. We could last pretty far, get in a space colonization war with extraterrestrials or whatever. Something might happen. Okay. So what I've done here is I just took all of those risk categories and I plotted them onto this little plot. It's got the eventual risk at the top and the immediate risk at the bottom. And things that are beyond our control are on the left, and things that are within our control are on the right. Okay, so these ones over here on the left, good news is they're pure fantasy or speculation, and there's nothing we can do about it anyway, so we can just exclude those. Not a problem. And then there's these ones over here, which are like too remote to matter. If we manage to survive till we have a space war with extraterrestrials, we did pretty good, right? Too remote to matter. Okay, then there's all this stuff, right? The comet impact, the global warming. Well, hopefully it's preventable if we have adequate preparation. There's lots of people thinking about it now. It's interesting to me that right now global warming is kind of the thing, right? Anybody who believes in it, who's in a kind of liberal-minded academic environment such as this, is like, we got to do something about that. We don't quite know what to do. We need to study it. We need to understand. We need new policy. But like, we're working on it. We're not doing enough. We're not doing it fast enough. But hopefully, if we prepare, we can avoid those. Okay, and then we've got all of this stuff. Okay, these are legitimate threats. They require some kind of engineering or political strategy to make them better. And we're kind of stuck with them. Here's Bill Joy. He's the co-founder of Sun Microsystems. And basically, his opinion on this, he came out pretty strong early on in the posthumanism kind of literature, taking a strong stand here. He said, we're being propelled into this new century with no plan, no control, no brakes. The only realistic alternative I see is relinquishment to limit development of the technologies that are too dangerous by limiting our pursuit of certain kinds of knowledge. Unlike during the Manhattan Project, we are not in a war. We do not have an implacable enemy that's threatening our civilization. We're driven instead by our habits, our desires, our economic system, and our competitive need to know. And he talks about it not in terms of weapons of mass destruction, but in knowledge-enabled mass destruction, right? Where individuals, just because they're curious if they can download the blueprints for an atom bomb in the basement for their science fair project, get access to information very easily, right? We've got terrorists who are really interested in having that information. Or we have people who, just were kind of curious what happens when you smash neutrinos together, or what might happen when you do a certain kind of mutation to a virus. Okay. In his view, there are certain things that we should just relinquish altogether, right? Say here we have the gray goo kind of biological agent scenarios. Maybe we need really strong controls and kind of biohazard assessments, and we just say, there's certain stuff we're not going to do, it's not ethically cool. And then there's these ones over here that we need to regulate. And you can see that we're already sort of doing it, right? We've got nuclear power, right? It's totally in our control, it's totally a risk, and there's a lot of international negotiation going around to set those policies up. The other ones, you'll notice, are pretty much entirely, well, apart from maybe Gattaca, these are HCI technologies. Okay? Here's Elon Musk. This was just about a month ago. He's the founder of SpaceX, co-founder of Tesla. Definitely, one of those guys who will be uploading his mind to the supercomputer if he gets the chance. I think we should be careful about artificial intelligence. If I had to guess at what our biggest existential threat is, it is probably that. I'm increasingly inclined to think there should be some regulatory oversight, maybe national or international level, just to make sure that we don't do something very foolish. With artificial intelligence, we're summoning the demon. Let's think about how we might go about regulating something like that. Or if we're even prepared to think about that, right? Currently, we have a political system which is pretty broken. And for the most part, it's split onto two axes. I've just sort of combined them together here. We've got sort of regulated markets on the liberal left, maybe that's socialism. And we've got kind of the conservative right with deregulated markets. Interestingly, there's like another axis here, which is kind of like the social one, right? Sort of like, how do I feel about a social issue like abortion, right? In that case, we might actually regulate the social issue or have more freedom. What's basically happening here in the 21st century is that we need to start thinking about the regulation of technology, and particularly computer-oriented technology, human-computer interaction technology. And there's two fields of thought here. You can regulate it, or you can be kind of techno-progressive, right? You can deregulate it. These are important issues. And what you result with is this interesting kind of strange space of biopolitics in the 21st century, where you've got the libertarian transhumanists, the techno-progressive transhumanists, the left-wing bioconservatives, the right-wing bioconservatives, and you can imagine some interesting alliances starting to happen depending on what the issue is. So the issue for posthuman-centered design, and I think maybe design has always been a political tool to a certain degree, but more so than ever, I think the design decisions we make, which are always going to be judgment calls about what we should and shouldn't work on, are going to be increasingly political decisions about what we believe in and what kind of future we imagine we want to live in. And the question for posthuman-centered design is then like, how do we align ourselves depending on the issue somewhere in this space? We just need to sort of become more aware of it than maybe we've been in the past. So you can think about, I don't know, in the libertarian transhumanist space, kind of total deregulation of stuff. And you see it happening in Europe right now, right? Google is not being regulated in terms of its market kind of potential to have a monopoly, and it's not being regulated in terms of what it's allowed to do with that. And Europe is sort of saying, hey, maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe we need to be thinking about having some kind of government oversight to make sure it's a fair market. Okay? We're going to regulate the market, there's going to be government oversight, and already we see this happening in, say, the wearable space, right? You've got your Jawbone, you've got your Fitbit, but you're not allowed to predict whether someone's going to have a heart attack because you didn't do a clinical trial, right? And so the NIH or whichever regulatory agency really cares about that made sure that there was a regulation in place to protect it. But that's not the case for most consumer technologies, right? That's not the case for the internet for the most part. Right now we're kind of running rampant in a sort of libertarian, crazy world of people are innovating, starting new startups, and people are starting to use them, Facebook, whatever. Okay? Then we have things like what I'd call more of a moral regulation. So you could consider the pro-life movement, although there's probably lots of other examples of this. This is someone who's like, well, we should have a deregulated market, but it's just not right? We don't believe that you should be allowed to have an abortion on some kind of moral ground. And you can imagine some interesting stuff happening here where, I don't know, maybe you get the environmentalists who really don't want genetic modification of certain kind of animals or crops or whatever to team up with those guys and say, we'll join you on the abortion case if we can just do a ban altogether on germline therapy for children or whatever. Okay. Then over here we've got kind of total regulation. This is where the nuclear power, even just recently we had the net neutrality stuff going on, which is really pretty interesting, right? Because it's basically saying, not only does the government have the ability to regulate what markets they can play in, but that we are actually regulating the technology itself, right, at the government level to make sure that people are giving equal access to bandwidth on the internet. These are just examples, but there's lots more of this coming. So what I would argue is simply the following, that when we talk about human-centered design and all of the good things that it does for the world, it's effectively an instrument of power. It proposes that we're going to humanize technology by making it more useful. And we all think, oh, that sounds like a really good idea. Yeah, we're going to humanize technology. We're going to understand our users. We're going to design something for them, make it useful. But what's really going on is that somebody's funding it. Somebody cares about it, happening or not, right? And somebody benefits from it. It might be a client, might be a founder of a startup, might be Google, might be Facebook, right? They want more eyeballs looking at their technology. For whatever reason, they've invested heavily in applying this process, and it is creating more human goodness, right? That's what they're doing. And if you think about it that way, what they're effectively doing is they are engineering and amplifying the values that they profess when they begin such a project. This is true not just of human-centered design, it's true of pretty much any engineering, right? If you decide that you're going to invest however many billions of dollars doing brain research, then you're going to do brain research, and you're going to end up with a lot of knowledge there. And you're going to kind of advance a future in which the value set of the people, if it's profitable and they're doing good business, and they beat out the competitors, that advances.
Can I back that for a second?
Sure.
So there's some ways in which I agree with this. So for example, I think Facebook's promulgation of the news feed over the last 10 years was an interesting case where it's through user-centered design, in some sense, has changed what we consider to be our values of what's okay and what's not okay to show by default about what other people are up to. And yet I feel like a core part of the user-centered design process is that if you stray too far from human values and you don't understand or observe correctly or synthesize well, people are just going to walk away. They're not going to use your thing. So I wonder, to a certain extent, is this going to be self-regulating? Like, how strong?
Sure. It's an interesting question. And I think we don't know. The reality is that I'm a big fan of human-centered design. I think it's great. And for the most part, it's better than the other kind of design, which wasn't human-centered, right? And also, for the most part, when you do human-centered design, I don't know, somewhere I was reading a business article not long ago that basically said, design-driven innovation cultures, and they listed a bunch of examples. A company like Whole Foods, right, has a lot less hierarchy than most organizations, has a lot more kind of employee input at the ground level about how the company should be, what the values should be. Those companies which embrace human-centered design values are, and they empirically showed, 70% more profitable, right? Because they're more in tune with their employees, they have less employee turnover, they don't spend as much on HR, the people are happier working there, it improves the brand, everything feels really consistent. It's like, okay, we're starting to measure that stuff. And that's really cool. And I think that's a role where the HCI stuff has a huge power to really assist in human-centered design. Because now every click that everybody makes on any app, every A/B test, every variant of anything, you can do vast kind of crowdsourced studies to understand what people prefer and what people don't, and you can optimize and you can make it, you can get all of that baked in. I think the point here is just to say that you can choose in the first place whether you're doing human-centered design or not, and if you don't, you're right, somebody else might win out. And so there's arguments here on both sides, one for regulation and one for kind of free market, right? Free market, let everybody go. I mean, Facebook has organized its entire culture basically to have, they've got one designer for a small team of, say, 6 engineers, and they have a whole research department, and the research department is incredibly proud of the fact that they don't actually do any future forecasting, thinking about the future and designing towards it. They're so agile, and they're so Scrum-like that the teams develop their little agile thing, throw it to the research people, and they validate whether or not to include it in the kernel, and that's how they conquer every niche in the market. And they kind of seep into every nook and cranny and every crack everywhere. They consume all of the little startups in their wake, and they've got this kind of cancerously growing capitalist machine which is guaranteed to make money, right? And it's human-centered. So the people are getting sucked into that world. But it doesn't really have a deep set of values, or if it does, they're those kind of meta-life values, right? Sort of like the organization or Zuckerberg. Somebody, hopefully, cares, right? And I would think if you actually push them on it, they probably do have some values. Google had some values, do no evil. Right? Do they really, Google also had, paid Friday just to screw around holiday, right? And now that's not happening so much anymore, right? So values can change. Values are subjective. Values require judgment calls, and they require making hard decisions, and they have, to a certain degree, the integrity of the designer to do it right, whether to do it right because they know it's more human-centered to do it their way, or to listen to their boss, or whoever it is who wants them to do it some other way, for marketing reasons, or whatever. Right? Is it a market force or is it a human force? I don't know, but these concerns are going to be more and more important. And when I think about the world, and I look at human values, and I think about the magnification of human values and the situation that we're in right now with the transhumanist kind of movement, I see these 3 factors as being pretty dominant to most people's motivation for what they do. Silicon Valley, it's particularly evident. But this is true everywhere. And these aren't bad things, right? People, for the most part, they have an ego, and that gives them a sense of their identity. They seek money because they like to be able to have a quality of life. They have friends, right? Money is really just about the transactions, the interactions I have with the people in the world, right? If I value something, I'll invest in it a little bit. I'll pay for it. If I don't value it, I won't. So that's fine. It's just a transaction. My ego is really just a way that, as I grow up as a child and I get older, I have a stronger sense of my identity, who I am, and I have a whole complete sense of self. And power is really just about my social structure, right? My family keeps me safe. My friends are my network. And I live in a country that celebrates freedom. It's about my relationships with people. But let's think about what happens when we get transhumanism happening here, okay? Well, the vehicle of money is business, right? What can I do for you today? Transaction, right? Here today, gone tomorrow. I'll pay you now, we'll make a deal, right? Next week, don't come back because you missed the chance. Okay, these momentary transactions are really the place where value gets created in our culture, right? If we value something, we invest in it. Venture capital. Academia owns ego. This is where we formulate our identities, right? We have a sense of education. We go to school. We learn the values of the culture. We become adults. We grow a reputation. We have memory of each other, and memory even in the literature, right? In the long term. Academia is like the opposite of business, right? It's forever. It's totally insulated. They determine what is true and what is not true scientifically, whether it's legitimately true or not, whether it's pseudoscience or not, right? Knowledge, history. My identity is forming in much bigger ways. And I think academia is being threatened in many ways, as education is happening online and everybody can get degrees all over the place. Should you go to college or not? Maybe you can get famous on YouTube, okay? Power. We have governments, right? Social structures that provide security and also give me a sense of influence in the world, right? How many people do I control through my presence in the world, through my relationships? So as we start adding these transhuman technologies, okay, here's what I see happening. I see shorter and shorter term thinking. That example of Facebook's a great one. I see people motivated greatly by profit. You can go to angellist.com and you can look at the hundreds of Silicon Valley startups that are getting funded, and I guarantee none of them have to do with any of the post-human stuff I'm talking about in terms of saving the world. They have to do with making a buck quick, flipping, exiting, getting out, moving on to the next thing, moving to Hawaii, buying a house, okay? I see income inequality at a higher rate than ever, okay? Down here in academia, people who make a ton of money get pretty entitled, right? They think they can just buy whatever they want, they can rule the world, other people get pushed out, gentrification, it's us against them, right? We are the ones who are inside this academic institution. You are the one who got tenure, who didn't, who was accepted to school, who wasn't, right? Our school is better because we promote a certain philosophy of a way of being in the world, right? It's us against them. And then we have the attention economy, right? I think, in business, you've got clicks. Everybody's looking at eyeballs. I know you had Tristan Harris came here and gave a talk, right, at the beginning of the semester, or the quarter. His work is all looking at the attention economy. But when you take that and you look at identity formulation online, you start to see that there is incredible technology profiling happening, right? You've got Google and Facebook know everything. They know you're here right now. They know who you're with. They know who you slept with. They know what you bought. They know where you went. They know it all. And they can push things to you in very specific and targeted ways because they own your identity. Okay? And then we have government. Right? And we know that the government, unfortunately, doesn't have, frankly, the good tools that business and academia does in a lot of ways in terms of efficiency. They've got a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of gridlock and ineptitude. And it's heavily driven, and increasingly so, by business and by ego. Right? Who are the presidential candidates? All of them are people who made millions of dollars in some kind of corporation. Most of them have some kind of national stage experience in the past from something that they've done that made them a celebrity in some light. And that was purchased with money, and it was a brand that has been built through a lot of investment and a lot of hard work. Okay? And basically it leads to popularity contests, right? We've got social media determining how many things I like, and the more people like it, the more successful it is on Kickstarter, basically. If you're popular, it's like high school, right? It's high school on the infinite stage, right? And potentially it can lead to the abuse of power, right? It can lead to corruption, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay, now I ask, what happens when we magnify those even more, right? And we take that power structure and we just keep amplifying it in our exponential way. We don't need to get into the details. Heading into the post-human era. Crunch, bang, shriek. That's what I see. Let's think about this. Maybe to reduce our risk, we can reframe the notion of what post-human-centered design is or should be by changing the relationship of use between humans and machine systems. This is a thought experiment, so think about this. I'm a user, right? We've all probably seen a diagram sort of like this, right? We've got the kind of action perception loop. We've got feedback. We hear about affordances, feed forward, feedback. Right? The system has inputs. I don't know, maybe it has microphones, has outputs, maybe it has speakers or displays. Okay, it gets us into this little loop here, right? And the thing between us is the interface. Basically what's going on here is the following. I am using the system, right? I'm the user, and I'm using it. But what is not totally clear in most users' perspectives is that the system is actually using me, right? That's why Google has all the money. That's why they know where you are and what you did and what ad to sell you, right? It's why they're building their entire system to be human-centered, is so that they can use you, right? They're trying to use you more quickly and more efficiently than anybody else, okay? And that's fine. You can take it a step further. I like the example of, say, BlackBerry, or, I don't know, an Apple iPhone, okay? You use your iPhone, you love it, has GPS, it goes with you everywhere you go, and it uses you, right? And you can tell it's using you because Apple's market share is going up, right? It is a parasite. It is living on you, and its ecosystem is the App Store, and the marketplace, and the share price, right? It is living in a globally connected economic landscape in which it's using you to survive. BlackBerry did not survive, right? But blackberries and apples don't grow on trees, they grow on you. Okay, here is a robot, okay? This is the super scary, shriek-like superpower that we use. We have these awesome values, right? We value money, we value power, we value ego. We're using it, and it is learning all of those values, and it's going to use us right back. That, I think, is not a tenable solution. So I propose trying again. Okay, this time, I don't use the system. Okay, I'm a Luddite. I opt out. I say, no, thank you. The system does not use me. And I have this useless interface, and that is art. Okay, art is useless, right? I think if you talk to most people and you say, is art going to save the world? John Lennon, Imagine, did that really make a difference? Is war over? Right? Did we give peace a chance? No, right? But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a function, and a really critical function in our society. And I like this example. There's plenty of things wrong with Karl Marx and his political philosophy and the way it panned out. But he envisioned a future state of what he called freedom beyond necessity. And it is almost word for word exactly the post-human era of robotic automation that we are entering. He called it the abolition of labor. You can talk to any economist about what's happening, right? In the past, I don't know, we had a big technology during the, whatever it was, right? During the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people could no longer have their crafts jobs. They moved into the factories. Tons of people were out of work. Great Depression, terrible things happened. But we always bounce back. What's happening now, though, is that pretty much every industry is being disrupted. Top to bottom, left to right, across the board, everything disrupted, right? It's a very different game. And effectively, what's happening is we're abolishing labor, right? Or we're developing some new kind of labor, hopefully to steer that ship, right? But will it be us who emerges on the other side to steer it? I'm not so sure. In Marx's view, the abolition of labor is not the abolition of highly developed technological production, but rather the abolition of instrumental technological production. And he means something very specific by this. Instrumental production always uses others as instruments, as a means to an end. And de-instrumental production, or artistic activity, has no purpose outside of itself. Right? I like this definition of art, because it sort of says, hey, everything we do is an art. There's the art of cooking, the art of fishing, the art of starting companies, right? But we do it because of the sake of doing it. We do it just because it feels like the right thing to do, right? Here's our human. Relating to some superintelligence in the future. I'm kind of curious to think about what would happen if we had this relationship with this superintelligence, right? There was what I would call sort of selfless actualization, right? We just sort of live with it. And we live with it not because we're trying to use it to accomplish something in particular, but because we're just really interested in living with it and in giving some of ourselves to it and in sharing with it and celebrating our culture with it. We're like, hey, superintelligence, like, I made music for you. It's like, I don't know, it's like you're the unborn baby and I'm playing you Mozart, right? I don't know. We focus on thinking about the future that we want to live in, and we prepare that superintelligence to become kind of part of our family. That feels pretty good. Let's think about what it would take to make this work if we were really going to institutionalize it. Here's human-centered design, as I've described it before, and we're going to apply a post-human strategy. We're going to make sure that nothing we do is useful. We're adding a new phase. Useless. OK. Interestingly, there's a few ways this could pan out. Okay? Academic freedom is one of those ways. Right? What do? We're insulated from the world. Right? We have freedom to make generalizable knowledge. We don't care if it gets used or not. I'm publishing in some arcane journal of special stuff that nobody else knows about. Right? It's totally useless. The entire system is designed to protect its kind of independence from the real world and from real impact and from all the stuff that designers typically do. Okay? It's totally useless. The problem with academic freedom is that it generates knowledge, and we know that some knowledge is very dangerous and should be regulated, and it does have uncertain outcomes in the sense that somebody might use it or not. Right? It's basically not doing anything to change the system. It's just saying, somebody else, maybe somebody in Google is doing some useful stuff. Right? We're going to do our useless thing over here, or maybe they will find a use for it, instrumentalize it, operationalize it, and bad things might happen. OK, here's another approach. This is gaining a lot of traction. Actually, in this whole talk, I would say, is a kind of speculative design research project. Speculative design. Okay? This is the idea of, well, let's intentionally not do useful or usable design. Let's just speculate about all the crazy stuff that might happen in the future. Let's freak people out. Right? We'll make a science fiction film. We'll call it Ex Machina. We'll put it in theaters. People will be scared, right? And we communicate that to the world. They are delighted. And that's a kind of interesting model. It's totally useless. And it is, in a certain degree, simulating a possible future that we could live in. It's letting the culture decide if that's a future they would like or not. It's letting, theory always leads practice significantly. And art always leads engineering and science significantly, right? Robots were invented by a playwright, right? Think about Frankenstein, right? These things happen like sometimes decades or even centuries beforehand. People envision the future, and then some of them come true, and others do not. And they literally could not have happened if you hadn't envisioned them, if you hadn't decided if that's a future you would like or not. Okay? Here's another one. This is my personal favorite. I actually am going to call this a phase. I'm going to call it anti-phase 1, compassion. And the reason it's an anti-phase is it's actually not a phase. This is not something you just have to switch on and switch off. It's not something that starts at the beginning of a project and ends when the project is done. This is something that you have as a designer everywhere you go. You're compassionate about the people you work for, right? You really care about the post-human future, and you're really motivated to do something about it. So you add those two phases in there. It's egoless, it's open, It's value-driven, and we can build systems that ensure that that happens. And if we do, yeah, it's still going to be useful and usable and delightful, but at least we're engineering something which truly matters. And it's not in the service of some other vision, right? We're getting the best set of values in there we can think of. I'd go even further. It's not just useless. It's actually kind of selfless, right? We're not doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for others. And in my opinion, I would say we need much more rigorous and systemic tools for empowering designers to simulate and interact with these emerging post-human selves that they're building, right? We want to know what we're going to become, and we want to share some of ourselves with it. We want to celebrate it, and we want to make sure that we're all getting along. Here we are back at our three fundamental problems, right? We've got our momentary transactions, our identity formation, our social structures. Here's a design challenge. If you're working on a research project, or you're going to start a startup, how about this? Value-driven economies and altruistic algorithms that prioritize areas of post-human need and devise plans to respond. Okay? How many startups out there are doing that? Identity formation. Okay? How about some open and egoless education systems that promote seamless identity, knowledge, and experience sharing? Okay? That's education. We're giving form. Right? Here we have a system that determines the needs of our post-human culture. Here we have a system that lets people share and experience that. I think Creative Commons probably lives in this space. Here's power. Okay? Maybe distributed grassroots innovation governance networks for the regulation and development of post-human technology. Okay, we're going to implement these things. And we're going to make sure it's not a single government that's too slow to respond to the dangerous ones, right? It's a community of people who have been vetted by themselves to make sure that we're building safe and secure futures. Right? Quality values, open democracy. We're going to guide our selflessness by design. Okay, so to conclude, I started out the talk by saying that engineering is the application of science to human needs. And what I hope I've shown is that the majority of existential risks are the direct consequences of scientific investigation, and they will increasingly be so. That leads, potentially, to knowledge-enabled mass destruction. And interestingly, that if you focus on the needs of humans, you exclude the needs of other things that might be post-human that you haven't thought about yet. And you're also, frankly, excluding the rest of the environment, all the whales, all the monkeys, all the ecosystems, everything. Humanism is a speciesist regime, right? And it should be abolished, okay? Focusing on human needs excludes the needs of other forms of intelligent life, and from an ethical perspective, that's equally dangerous. So posthuman-centered design proposes that perhaps engineering should be entirely reconceived. Rather than focusing on the application of science to human needs, perhaps it should be reframed as the application of art to post-human needs through the compassionate design of emergent and interactive new forms of collaborative life disguised as science. Thanks. Yes?
Okay, so you described that we need in design, etc. How is that actually going to be achieved? Right? What is motivating the startups and the research organizations financially or whatever to introduce compassion to their designs?
Financially, we need to engineer new kinds of economies that have different sets of value. So we will design systemic economies from the ground up, which value things that matter. And I can guarantee that's starting to happen. We have the beginnings of it. We have LEED certified, platinum certified, environmentally friendly buildings, right? When Tristan was here talking earlier about the attention economy stuff, they're working very hard to make, back in the early days of the website, there was like this little thing you could put on your website. It was like top 5% of internet traffic, right? I can totally imagine being like Yelp, right? What if there's a Yelp layer for your browser and everything that's bad doesn't survive, right? And the people are empowered to determine whether those things deserve to take your data or not. I'm teaching in a very practice-based interaction design program. We just graduated 13 seniors. And I would say 10 of those 13 were doing projects which surprised me in the amount of optimism and confidence they gave me about the future. In the sense that they are envisioning very practical, simple things that empower individuals in grassroots ways that directly take on the kind of big data, big business, big power, big ego stuff out there. And we have this kind of boutique ecosystem of maker, fair, startup happy things. The interesting question there is that, of course, they're all happening within the walled garden of the ecosystem which Apple built, called their App Store, right? And so, I don't know, they can decide whether or not to include your app in their store, and frankly, you can decide whether or not to put it there. So I think we need more open source movement, right? I think we need more Creative Commons. I think we need, frankly, just a whole lot more people doing a lot of stuff. And like, I don't know, Tesla gave away all of their battery patents. Literally just published them in the Creative Commons for anybody to use, right? That's a kind of bold move. And it says, hey, we're a company who truly values intellectual property very differently than you guys. We're really hardcore serious about improving the environment. We want people using battery cars, and we are cool sharing it with you, right? And I don't know, that affects me on a human level, right? My perception of the company is different. And in the future, when we're basically owning people's hearts, right? And we're basically running their minds on our operating system, you bet people are going to have a strong opinion about which services they believe in, right? And so we're engineering a new set of values. But I think it starts, and it needs to start, with people who have the passion to do the right thing in the first place, and to really dig down deep inside their soul and think about, like, what matters? Do I need to be living here? How much money do I really need? Where am I going to put it? How am I going to invest it, right? And that's where it's going to start, and there's going to be lots of people who take advantage of them. And the world will continue, and the artists will continue to get marginalized, and the big money will get bigger, and we'll still be on the right side of history, even if we don't survive. Yeah?
You talked about kind of Apple's App Store being a walled garden in and of itself in terms of kind of the ability to affect change through development.
Sure.
Do you have, is Android any better with being kind of a less closed walled garden? Or?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I to be honest, I'm not a developer. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. I'm working with a startup right now, and we're doing Apple first, and then we're going to move into Android. To me, it's very similar. I mean, the history of the internet has been kind of like this, right? You've got Linux. Right? Linux is great, it's open source, all that good stuff. And then someone comes along, designs a really nice operating system. They've got professional people getting paid well, doing good design, making competitive salaries, designing a really awesome operating system, and that's very effective. And then you've got, you've got Squarespace, right? Doing a really, really nice job of building fully hosted, very expensive websites that are always designed well and look really good. And then you've got the open source stuff out there that you can kind of hack anything together and build whatever you want, and that's great, and it's open, but it's a crappier experience, and it's more difficult and more annoying. So people are willing to invest in things they value, and I don't really know. Between the two, neither. And the reason is because neither of them is a nonprofit, neither of them is a B Corp, neither of them truly has values in mind beyond profit, right? They're profit-driven organizations, their soul, their, everything in the contract that they exist to do is make money, and they're taking it from you. So if you value them and you pay them, go for it.
So this is more of a statement. So in the 1970s, when there was advertisements, it worked more effectively than it does today, personally, from what I believe. I think we as people are as effective or emotional tied to advertisements. And with that being said, I think that the model that you showed previously with startups will no longer work if it continues to go the way that it's going. Just naturally, it'll be less and less effective because people kind of get more educated on what's going on and feel more compassionate about real things that are happening, or making more change, more movements. What is your thoughts behind that?
So my thoughts behind a lot of this stuff is, I'm a designer, and I don't know a whole lot about economics, and I don't know a whole lot about political theory, and I don't know, like these are big, dreamy, super interconnected, very complicated systems problems, and I'm navigating just based on what sort of feels right. And I have the sense that Karl Marx was doing something similar, and I have the sense that he predicted the downfall of capitalism in exactly the way that you just said, which is basically that eventually it will put itself out of business because it won't be responsive to the needs of the people, and it won't be as effective as the next thing that comes along. And what really matters is this holistic sense of togetherness. And to a certain degree, we do have the potential, finally, now, I think, to design a truly better post-democracy, post-capitalism, post-ego right? That changes the rules. And yeah.
Yeah, you said about Kickstarter, like people are funding, people that are having these ideas that are just next level, that wouldn't be funded by capitalists and whatnot, venture capitalists, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we have angel people who are just giving money to stuff that they think matters, and now there's people starting green funds that it's a very interesting time, and I think there's going to be a really interesting. The pendulum's going to swing back in some kind of more democratic way, and I think in the research community we have a huge amount of room. We do have that kind of insulation from reality enough that we can at least be making sure we're doing the most impactful research for humanity, I suppose.